Thanks, and hello everyone. And I think it was about 4 years ago that I last came to speak here, which I think I was doing a presentation on the World Cup 2014. And I think the reason that you asked me to come and speak is because it's after one of these really big events, which are the biggest things that we've done, which drive ridiculous amounts of traffic and always push the boundary a certain amount. So I should just introduce myself very briefly. Then I'm Richard Cooper. I run a group in the BBC called the Online Technology Group. We provide the foundation technology, distribution and operations for everything that the BBC does online. We do not do all of what I'm going to talk about today. There's a whole load of other colleagues in the BBC, because the focus of today is around networks. Then that's probably closest to what I talk about. So here, I think I'll cover a certain amount around the capacity, the performance, and so on related to the regular HD streaming that we were doing for the World Cup. But I'll focus a little bit more on what we did for UHD, because that was the new thing, and it's also a slightly scary thing in terms of the indication of what that could mean for the future. You know, it won't surprise you to hear that some of the bandwidth associated with delivering UHD streams is fairly phenomenal. Some of the interest in it was pretty high. The ability to do it is growing, and it's worth a conversation at some point as to whether or not the way that we're doing this stuff is going to be most appropriate as time goes on. Anyway. Moving on. So first of all, let's talk a little bit about UHD. Now, broadcasting has changed a lot over the last 20 years, but actually the fundamental characteristics of the pictures that are being broadcast really haven't. We started digital broadcasting back in the 90s, and digital broadcasting was all about taking what was an analog broadcast and delivering it over some very clever digital distribution technology. But fundamentally, the picture was the same. The only thing that we did was stretch the same number of pixels and call it 16 by 9. And then some more clever distribution technology came up a few years later. Got very close to the Shannon limit for those people who care about that kind of stuff. So you never need to do it again with DVB-S2 and DVB-T2, which got greater efficiency. And off the back of that, we then put HD out on broadcast. But HD was fundamentally pretty much exactly the same thing, the same picture characteristics, the only difference being an increase in number of pixels. And now what you see now is that obviously consumer manufacturers have produced a whole load of sets that are 4K capable, and any camera that you get probably these days will be 4K, and it won't be long before you won't touch anything that isn't 4K. But the argument we've been making, though, is that just having more pixels isn't good enough. You want them to be better pixels. So I'm going to spend a couple of seconds just talking about the difference between UHD and 4K and what makes those pixels better pixels. Well, first of all, undeniably, there are more pixels. There are exactly 4 times the number of pixels that there are in a full resolution HD picture for those people who broadcast them. And for people who have the right sort of environment at home, that's terrific. But you might have seen charts like this. Who's seen a chart like this? They're doing the rounds? Nope, nobody then obviously works in this space. And this gives an indication of actually the reality of the benefit that you get from more pixels. And obviously there's a bit of a negotiation going on here, because it's dependent on your visual acuity, and that varies from person to person. It also depends on the size of TV set you have, how far away from the TV set you are when you're watching it, and what sort of negotiations you have with your partner about fixing any of that. But this chart here kind of shows you in each of the bands what's worth it in terms of the size of the TV you have, the distance away from it that you are, and what resolution is worth it, in other words, the benefit you can get from that. And there are a number of variations of this one doing the rounds. This is for people who have 20/20 vision. 20/20 vision, by the way, 20/20 vision. 20/20 vision is not perfect vision. 20/20 vision just means that if you're 20 feet away, in American terms, from a standard eye chart, you can see on average what everybody else can see when they're 20 feet away. Younger people tend to have better vision than that. Older people can be slightly worse. But anyway, I've done the graph on the basis of my age and therefore picking 20/20 vision. And the average distance that people tend to sit away from a TV screen in the UK is about 2.6 meters. So that's the dotted line that's kind of going across. And if you follow the dotted line across, it's not until you get to the purple area, the UHD 2140 area, that you're actually really getting a benefit of having all those additional pixels. If you're not on that area, then actually you wouldn't have been able to see the pixels that were on an HD display, so you might as well have used that. And so that says that if you're sitting 2.6 meters away from your set, you probably need to go and get yourself a 65-inch set if you really want to get benefit just of having more pixels on your TV. Who's got a 65-inch set or bigger? Anyone? A few people here, that's good. And do you sit 2.6 meters away or closer? I guess that's very difficult to answer that question by raising your hand, I recognize that. But it shows people get benefit from it. Not everyone gets benefit from it. Incidentally, one of the benefits you get is that if you walk closer to the TV set, the pictures get sharper. So in that respect, it's more representative of lifelike pictures than otherwise. But anyway, that's just one of the first characteristics of UHD. There are more. In fact, there are 3 more. And the first of those is actually the range of colors that it can represent. So this is something, again, that hasn't changed for a long time. This hasn't changed since back in the 90s. And what that chart shows, the total color range there is effectively what the eyes can see. But then there's that dotted line going around the middle of it, which is called Poynter's gamut of real surface colors. And that represents all of the colors that can be reflected off any surface of any material of any object. And so in practice, that represents real-life colors. Now, you can generate different colors with lights and so on, but in terms of what you see when you go out into the world, that's the range of colors. And if you can see it, there's a little triangle inside that, and that's the triangle that represents the colors that you can see on non-UHD displays, right? That's assumed to be the total color gamut. And there's a new standard, the BT 2020 standard, that's used then within UHD. It's a wider triangle that goes outside that. And you can see that's pretty much job done in the sense that in almost all cases, that then represents all of the colors that in practice you'll find in nature. Now, that gives an opportunity for us to be able to deliver much more realistic colors. Interestingly, this is the beginning perhaps of a battle with CE manufacturers, because typically the way that a set's set up is not to represent natural colors. You tend to have the saturation turned right up. You get very much punchier colored, vivid modes, and so on. And so ultimately, that's going to depend on the CE manufacturer's default and what you choose to do. But what UHD will allow you to do is have a more representative set of colors on your set if you want to. So that's a thing called wider color gamut. Then there's the higher dynamic range. So again, the dynamic range on traditional telly has been limited by the ability of display tubes and cameras of that era to be able to represent a certain amount of contrast, the amount of noise they have, and so on. And so actually, fundamentally, they will tend to crush the blacks and crush the whites in order to be able to give you a reasonable amount of detail of where the action is. And the whole idea behind the higher dynamic range is to be able to fundamentally deliver better detail in the blacks, because modern tellies can show you that, and much, much brighter whites, so that you don't actually have to crush the highlights and you can see the details in the whites as well. And so that's an important characteristic of high dynamic range, is that if white's there on a normal telly, then on an HDR telly, you expect the same kind of whites to be at the same level, and it's just those peak whites sitting above it. So expect and you need a telly which actually has the ability to deliver those brighter images, but not doing it all the time, so that it looks normal when compared with a standard dynamic range telly. That's an interesting challenge, because actually a lot of tellies at the moment are not set up like that, and so they will tend to take their standard dynamic range picture and put that up to full white. At the same time, with their high dynamic range one, they put that to the same wall light, which full white, which means that actually the HDR picture can look a little bit darker. These are early days, I think, for getting this stuff to work, and as more bright tellies come out, then you won't tend to want to have the brightness so high, and you'll get the more punchier effect. That's an attempt to demonstrate the benefit of HDR, which the right-hand side is with HDR applied, so you get more of the whites. The left-hand side doesn't have applied, to give some sort of indication of the additional luminance information that can be carried by HDR. And then the final one of the UHD characteristics I'm going to talk about is the higher frame rate. So it always seems surprising to me that we still do 50 hertz on our tellies today, because the mains was at 50 hertz, and so we've just kind of stuck with that. So it's either 25p or 50i, which is interlaced typically. What you find, though, as you're looking on larger displays, is that judder becomes more visible. And actually what we're doing is we deliver more pixels, is we're superserving the spatial resolution of your eye while we're underserving the ability of your brain to represent the temporal motion. And so you can see here, I think on those two pictures, if you can see from where you're sitting, that fundamentally there's not too much difference between the cyclists, because this is a tracking picture as the camera's tracking the motion. But for the 50 hertz, then the visitor parking sign looks blurred on the right-hand side, where it's sharp on the left-hand side. And as the screen gets bigger, that gets more obvious as you're tracking motion, and you see things swim in and out of, appear to swim in and out of focus. So we didn't do high frame rate for the World Cup for some compatibility reasons, because we discovered there were too many issues in terms of getting that to work. But we did, as part of an experiment, for the European Championships, which have just passed. But we did all of the other ones. So fundamentally, in terms of what we were then delivering online for UHD, we delivered the full-blown 3840 by 2160 p50, which is full-resolution UHD, and that was 36 megabits a second. And then a number of other bit rates, all the way down to 1280 by 720 at 7 megabits a second. And we included that bottom one, because that's actually what we do on iPlayer at the moment. That's your regular iPlayer streaming. Difference being is that although it doesn't have more pixels, it has all the rest of the UHD goodness on there. So you should still get a better picture through that on a compatible telly than you get if you're just looking at regular iPlayer streaming. So when I say compatible telly, we did demand a certain amount of compatibility around tellies. And so this was done as a trial, but as an indication of where the service is going to go going forwards. And there are some standards out there which we think are non-negotiable here. So HEVC for the encoding, so that's kind of H.265, a particular profile of it. And then a thing called DVB- for the packaging. The packaging is the thing that takes a stream of video and chunks it up into basically HTTP chunks, which can then be delivered over the internet. And so we use the DVB- standard for that. And we demanded support for the new wider color gamut, color space. We didn't demand support for the for HDR, because actually the mechanism HDR we were using was backwards compatible. So anyway, so that's what we decided we were going to broadcast. We came to the conclusion we thought we could probably do it, but we thought we'd have a bit of a check and see, well, how many people are actually going to be able to receive this stuff? So the best thing we had to go by for a bit of learning there was Blue Planet 2. So who watched Blue Planet 2 in UHD? Did anybody? UHD? I'm biased because I work for the BBC. I thought it was absolutely fantastic. But we also got a fair amount of data around who could consume it at the various different bit rates. And that allowed us to build a bit of a predictor to get some sort of idea of people who are using those sorts of sets, what sort of bit rate they'd be able to achieve, and therefore what proportion of people will be able to get the various different bit rates that we decided that we needed to use to give a good quality on live. So this graph here is all of the consumption of people who were watching Blue Planet 2 before and through Christmas. And the blue line is showing, so it's a cumulative distribution graph, which means across the bottom, you've got the megabits a second, which are being achieved in terms of throughput. And on the left-hand axis, you've got the likelihood of being able to achieve that. And so what that says is that for people who are on the top bit rate, which was around 25 megabits a second or thereabouts, you were getting about 40% of the connections were able to support that. So some people could, but quite a lot of people couldn't at that bit rate. And then the orange line was an extrapolation of that based on the data that we've got of how long each of the chunks were being taken to deliver on those individual connections to work out actually how fast we think we could go. And so when you get up to 36 megabits a second, we reckon only about 30% of people will be able to get that. So that was our starting point going into to delivering the UHD. So we made the announcement around doing UHD for the football. And then our marketing and sport team got a little bit excited, and they decided to also make an announcement at the same time that we were going to do Wimbledon. So that all of a sudden made our life a lot more complicated from an operational perspective, because this stuff's all brand new, right? We're building a brand new chain for the whole thing. And the thing about World Cup and Wimbledon is they're both popular events and they both overlap with each other. So operationally entertaining. But actually from an online consumption perspective, footy is way, way, way bigger than Wimbledon. So from a capacity perspective, Wimbledon wasn't really relevant. So I don't think I'll mention it again. So on to actually doing the UHD coverage of the World Cup. Who watched it, by the way? UHD covered the World Cup. 1, 2. Actually, that's a good number of you. But then typically, I would imagine people in this room are representative of early adopters. So all the studio shots, actually, that's all in HD. So we didn't have UHD in the studio. Not surprisingly, that's a very complicated studio. It's got a whole load of augmented reality features, like the scores and information and so on, that pop up in front of it. And so that was then, for UHD, that was up-converted, but actually even up-converted HD on UHD we thought looked pretty good. But then the production itself, we were taking feeds from the host broadcaster, so we don't produce those feeds, we take them and process them and combine them with everything else. And you have to remember that in doing this, we had to make an HD broadcast, which tens of millions of people were going to be watching, so that's kind of got to be focus, and a UHD broadcast where all of these feeds, UHD feeds coming out of the Russian stadia, the HD feeds that are being mixed in, some of them had HDR, some of them didn't have HDR, turning them all into something and then slaving them together so you have two identical channels, one in UHD and one in HD, is a pretty complex operation, pretty new for everybody. And the way that it worked then, the feeds coming in from Russia were kind of there and ready to broadcast. They came in and we kind of fed them on because we had some feeds of those that weren't elsewhere. They then go into a decoder which turns them into baseband. Baseband UHD is big. Well, funnily enough, it's 4 times as big as HD. And so at that point, we fed it into the BBC's infrastructure just by splitting it into 4. So effectively, it really is 4 HD pictures being routed all the way around Broadcasting House, which is where all this stuff was done, through the matrix in there, matrix being the term that we use in broadcast for a router. And the output of the matrix then allowed our various different operational teams to see what was going on, to feed it through a down converter to the sport team up in Salford so they could see whether or not the stream was even working or not. Before going out to the public. And then we fed it into encoders. Now, normally these days, actually, we do our encoding for our distribution encoding in the cloud. But for UHD, this is still early days. And so these were steaming bits of metal. So it's all software encoding, but PCs, each PC had 4 GPUs in just to be able to get that encoding done. Into the packager, and then into a repository, so we actually kept everything if we ever needed to go back and make an on-demand asset, and then down through the distribution chain, through to the viewers, and also through to my operational team who'd be looking at it as well. In terms of how it works then from a distribution perspective, if you're watching it in your telly, then your telly goes and pulls a thing called a manifest, which describes where to get the video and the audio from, and then it's pulling 4-second chunks of video and audio, and it'll be pulling them from whichever CDN edge we've told you to pull it from. And that CDN will be pulling that from mid-tier caches. And the mid-tier caches pull it from an origin that we run ourselves. And that origin then pulls it from that repository. And that was pretty much the chain that we were doing. And there's some benefits in doing it that way, in that makes it very easy for you to mix live and on-demand so that we can make on-demand assets very quickly, or you can pause and rewind live TV, which actually were features we didn't do for the UHD this time around. But it does introduce some fragility, because if at any point you have any issue at all with any one of those chunks, the whole chain collapses. At best, you get buffering, and at worst, you lose your picture altogether. So finally then, on this bit, how you actually got onto it, we didn't tie it terribly closely to broadcast. So you had to launch iPlayer, you went into iPlayer. If you're on a compatible telly, then we would offer that little panel at on the left-hand side, the UHD. You click on that, and that will take you to the live UHD stream. Right, so that's a quick romp through UHD and how we put the whole thing together. Now a bit about the capacity planning. So the thing about World Cups is, one thing we know about it is it's definitely going to be the biggest thing we've ever done. That's kind of always a given. And the UHD is very interesting. While the UHD is very interesting, we know that we're probably at some point going to get around 1 million people, concurrent viewers, on various different devices of our regular coverage of the World Cup. So one thing we don't want to do is get excited with the UHD and discover as a consequence of that we've run out of CDN capacity, or we've started to congest networks and what have you. The consequence being that everyone then has a bad time. Because actually, these days, it's not segregated traffic, it's all HTTP chunks, it's all coming from the same servers. So when something goes wrong with one of our services, it tends to go wrong with all of it. So first part of capacity planning is look back at history. So this is the history. These, sorry, I haven't got the scale on there, but this is historical peaks in gigabits a second each month going back to February 2011. So the first one over on the left there, that was the royal wedding back then. Then in 2012, you probably remember there was a little thing called the Olympics. And then in 2013, that peak there, that was Andy Murray winning Wimbledon for the first time. And then 2014, well, that would be football. That was the last World Cup. 2016, that would be football. That was Euros 2016. And then a bunch of other things coming through. And given where we are, there was a surprisingly large peak when was it? When was the One Love Manchester concert? Do you remember? That was one of the big peaks, which you simply didn't predict. It was almost as big as the football when that one came through. So much interest. Yeah. And then the rest of the stuff. And then the May one, that peak there was Royal Wedding Mark II. The dotted line is the dotted line representing a growth rate or a factor of 2 every 2 years. It's almost exactly that. So that's near enough, 40% compound annual growth rate. And that's what we've been seeing since 2011. If you look at that a different way, so this is normalizing all of that. So you just take the growth out and see what it looks like. And you can see, actually, that tells you two things. One is, actually, that compound annual growth rate of 40%, and in other words, growing by a factor of 2 every 2 years, has been pretty consistent. But from time to time, you get a big peak coming through, which is about twice where you think that growth rate ought to be. And the big peaks, funnily enough, tend to align with football. So pretty good predictor of what we were expecting for the football this time around is that we'd be up at a factor of about 2 on this chart, which actually means compared with where we thought we were going to be, that could take us up close to about 5 terabits a second. 5 terabits a second is quite a lot of traffic. So that's the first part of it. Second part of it is the anatomy of a football match. These are all the football matches of the Euros 2016, right? And there was quite a big one at the beginning. Anyone remember what that was? As in on the left-hand side of the chart.
England losing?
England-Wales. I don't remember us losing that one. That was about 2.4 terabits a second that went up to. Quite an outlier compared with everything else. But one of the real challenges that we have is this stuff, business as usual, awful lot of matches going through. How do we get this into a position where you can just operate it without having to have your A-team heroes managing every single game? So the idea behind this was, looking at this, was to see how can we make the whole thing predictable so that if we see something that's going to be big enough, that means that we have to react, and we do sometimes have to react. We might react by moving traffic between CDNs to improve the balance, or we might have to react by pulling top bit rates if we're getting close to what we think is a capacity limit. How do we actually know that's going to happen in time? And it turns out people are quite predictable. Here are the 3 FA Cups for the last 3 years that we covered. Similar matches, all at the same time, quite good comparisons. And if you apply a scaling factor to the blue one, which is the 2016 match, and the red one, which is the 2017 match, so they're about the same size as the 2018 one, you see it overlaps very, very closely. So funnily enough, the shape of a football match is entirely predictable, so predictable that you can actually then produce what is effectively the definition of what the traffic of a football match looks like, normalized to a factor of 1 at 0 at the bottom, which is the point of kickoff. And we took that a little bit further because normally our coverage starts about 30 minutes before kickoff. So we tailed it down in terms of where we thought the coverage, where traffic typically would be just before kickoff, and then built a very simple automated system which takes the real-time traffic coming in. And that means before you've even got to kickoff, we can predict where we think the peak traffic is going to be. And so the operational teams then can just look up on a recipe book and see, okay, so it's going to be a really big match. We need to do something about it. We need to react. We need to call out people who need to be called out, or we can just sit back and enjoy. And unfortunately, that was the system that we just switched on for the World Cup and then had no relevance after that, so we got rid of it again. So I forgot to take a screenshot of this. So this instead is a dump of data out of it. And so this was one of the games. I can't remember. It's France versus, I think it says in a moment. And so this is as the build-up is happening, but well before kickoff. And then the automated system just puts in the, OK, if it's that sort of size, this is what the traffic level is going to look like, with a very good degree of confidence that it's going to be there or thereabouts. And it was actually, no, this was France-Belgium I took it for, and that was the traffic for the real match. So we thought we'd cracked it. We can just turn the World Cup into business as usual. We take all the heroes, the A-team, the people who design this stuff, say, don't be operational, just keep going with your day job. Well, that was the theory. In practice, we had so much fun doing the UHD that they were all there anyway watching, and so the whole of this stuff handing across to operations actually wasn't as effective as we'd like it to be. But next time, hopefully. So that's the capacity planning for HD. How about capacity planning for UHD? Well, to be honest, we hadn't got a clue how popular that was going to be. We knew a certain amount. We knew there were about 2 million devices out there which would be compatible with the streams we were delivering. But the big difference between UHD and HD is that for HD, actually, that's just streaming over IP, and the reason that you're watching that is because you can't watch it on a telly. So you happen to be somewhere. I had one of my colleagues who was in a wedding, actually, and was watching at the back. But it's when you haven't got a telly in front of it, you use it. So it's a way of making sure you don't miss something when you can't watch it on telly. UHD, you can only watch this on a telly. That's the only device we made it available on. So you could be watching broadcast, or you could be watching it on your telly. So how many people are actually going to transition from watching a broadcast to watching on the telly in higher quality? And the answer is, we don't know because we've never tried that before. We also didn't know what the impact of this would be. So you've got Gary Lineker, who's sitting there, and he's got 10, in worst case, 20 million people who are kind of watching a live match. And Gary can say, we've got this brand new UHD trial running, so go into iPlayer and try it now, right? Those can drive really significant numbers. And so we were very concerned about all of this, so we started to do some maths. First bit of maths, OK, worst case, worst case. 2 million devices, maximum bitrate 36 megabits a second. Absolute worst case, guarantee we can cover this, 72 terabits a second. Anyone know any CDNs out there who could give me 72 terabits a second? If they could, if you add up all your networks, could you distribute 72 terabits a second anywhere? So clearly, big numbers we have to worry about. Okay. Now, in practice, of course, that's worst case, and that's never going to happen. So a more reasonable worst case, we've still got our 2 million devices. You get pretty high reach figures for covering a footy match, particularly if England's playing. So 50% household share, so maybe 1 million of those devices available. 10% are prepared to try it, or thereabouts. Average bit rate, probably 25 megabits a second, so that's about 2.5 terabits a second. OK, that's a bit more of a goer. But what we decided to do is, rather than just wing it and see, because we really didn't have any science that we could put behind these numbers, is do it the other way around and say we're simply going to set a cap. So we set a cap on the basis that we thought we could safely add about 1.5 terabits a second without causing damage to our prime viewers, who are the ones on the HD streams. And so you wind back the other way, and that meant set a cap of 60,000 people. We had no idea if that was going to be the right number or not. But anyway, that was the number that we went for. And then the marketing message behind that said, it's a trial, there are a limited number of slots, first come, first served. And of course, we've got a dial, we can turn that number up and down and so on as we get through the World Cup and see how we get on. So what happened? These are the first 5 games. So this is in terms of concurrent users for the first 5 games. Portugal versus Spain, of course, was the first evening game that we covered. So that's great, having a nice big one on brand new infrastructure that hasn't really been tried out before. But what you can see there is actually we've got 2, Germany versus Mexico and France versus Australia, where actually things went pretty wrong. So both of those, we dumped a whole load of people off the live stream. And that was one of the characteristics of having built such new infrastructure that really had an opportunity of being tested before. And it was down to the fact that everything has got to be absolutely reliable for delivering a 4-second chunk all the way through the chain, all the way through to the end without a single interruption. In both those cases, actually in one case, it was just a grubby optic, and that was enough to do it. So more work required in terms of the resilience around that. Anyway, we did quite a lot of work. To get that more robust. And we ran fairly happily then for the next few games until someone somewhere was brave enough to ring up the sport production team in Russia and say, go on then, have a go at a call to action, let's see what happens. So that was Iran versus Portugal, and they did 2 calls to action. Is that going to be a pointer? Yes, it is. There we go. And the first one's there, and which is the beginning of the first half, and the second one's there, which is the beginning of the second half. So that's an Iran versus Portugal, which is not that that popular a game. And both of those were just in vision. It wasn't Gary sitting there exhorting you to try it. And that's a step of 10,000 users over a couple of minutes. Just shows the power of broadcast. So we could have gone bigger than that if we wanted to go bigger than that. To be honest, that was about right for us. And so then putting it all together, actually, that top line here, sorry, we haven't got the axis on there, but that line there, that's the 60,000 limit. We never changed the 60,000 limit because actually, as it turned out, it was about right. This game here is the England-Sweden game, which is the biggest one that we did. And you can see we just came up to the limit. We were thinking, well, shall we increase the limit? But given that we weren't going to do any more calls to action, we left it where it was rather than making changes. And we probably disappointed a few viewers along there, but in practice it had pretty much leveled out. So as it turned out, we got it about right. Feedback on UHD actually was enormously positive. I don't know what the people who tried it thought. There was a lot of good feedback associated with the fact that, okay, it's a trial, we recognize it as a trial, there are some rough bits at the edges, but it's good to give it a go. But then there were two fairly concrete bits of feedback, and the first of those, broadcast. There's a goal. Now, at the beginning, you wouldn't be waiting 45 seconds. When I say the beginning, I mean early on in the tournament. The latency was probably a minimum of about 1.5 minutes or thereabouts. You'd have to wait, which is a long, long, long time to wait, because that was how far behind broadcast the UHD stream was. As all the encoding's happening and the various different things, you've got to make sure that they are, as a hand chunks along, every time something hands a chunk along, that's another 4 seconds. And there's a certain amount of other stuff built in. And I've been talking for about 25 seconds since the slide went up, and you're still not there. And then finally, eventually on UHD, you get a goal. Meanwhile, your phone has probably shouted at you, there's a goal. Your neighbors, you can hear them cheering. If you're working at the office, it's enormously annoying as you hear people cheer, and they haven't even, not even that side. So latency, big problem. Actually, the feedback we got said that don't compromise on picture quality to improve latency. Nevertheless, it's something that's a fair amount of work going on in the R&D and standardization bodies around how we can actually deliver this sort of stuff efficiently. The other one was the pictures being too dark when compared with standard def. And this was the problem I talked about before, primarily. Part of it was actually just the complexity of the operation out in Russia and getting all the cameras set up correct, because that's enormously complicated anyway, and we don't have a lot of experience of that. The other side, though, is that tellies, as I was saying, ones that support high dynamic range actually were kind of cheating. And so they used the same white for normal dynamic range as peak white for high dynamic range, which means the HDR stuff then would look comparatively darker. So there's a bit more work to do around that, but generally otherwise feedback was pretty good. Romping on very quickly then around performance, you can give all yourselves, if you're an eyeball network, a pat on the back, because we were generally surprised at how many people managed to, what proportion of people managed to get the highest bit rate. Now clearly, these are early adopters doing this stuff. They're probably on better networks which got faster connectivity. But 58% of all connections were getting the 36 megabit per second stream, which was astonishing as far as we were concerned. So our average bit rate overall was about 27 megabits a second. Not all ISPs were the same, though. This is the same breakdown done by ISPs. So we got the five biggest ISPs in terms of the amount of traffic we see over the collections of AS that we deem to be an ISP, and then other. And you can see a significant variation there, which we don't have a huge amount of insight into. We assume that it's down as much as anything else to the proportion of people on those networks who happen to have the higher speed connections on them. And then some of these ISPs are more expensive than other ones, and so maybe more likely to be the ones that are picked up by early adopters. We don't know, but we were genuinely surprised to see that variation in breakdown across the networks. And then not all devices are the same either. So some of the devices, like the one over on the left-hand side, the vast majority of the connections were on the highest bit rate. Other devices, so device 8, which is the one almost on the right-hand side, that's actually a well-known household name. And it advertised itself as a 4K UHD kind of ready telly, and it barely managed to do any at the top bit rate. Really, that's just an indication that it's still quite early days, but given that the standards for what we were doing were barely dry, I think this all actually went pretty well, and you can expect all this stuff to improve pretty rapidly over time. almost there, but just very quickly on the performance that we actually delivered to the HD users. This graph looks a little bit complicated, but this was for our biggest match. So this was England versus Sweden. The grey line there is on the right-hand axis, which is the number of gigabits a second that we were delivering of all the services, not just HD, but UHD as well, and went up to about 5.5 terabits a second. And these two coloured lines were two of the CDNs we're using, the average bit rate we're delivering off those CDNs. And what you see is, even at the highest bit rates, total traffic, the average bit rates were staying pretty constant. If you wonder what the blip is in the middle, that's half-time. When people leave at half-time, you've got more people leaving than joining streams, and when people join streams, they join at lower bit rate and then climb up. So when you join, you see the average bit rates go down. When they leave, the average bit rates go up. But otherwise, as far as we're concerned, that's as close as you get to perfect. Right? So no sign, again, give yourselves a pat on the back, no sign of congestion in networks or anything like that. And exactly the same for UHD performance. Same issue around step change in bit rate when there was a call to action there, where a large number of people joined. But then as we came up and sat at the 60,000, then the average bit rate was sitting, and in fact it was growing slightly, which again is more people staying rather than joining as you get later into the match, above 25 megabits a second. So overall, fantastic job by UK Internet. I think well done to everybody. Of course, the only downside from my perspective is now we don't know how much bigger we could have gone. So 5.5 we know works well. How much bigger than that can we go? Don't know. What we do know is that the next time one of these things comes around, it's going to be bigger again. So this is going back to that capacity chart, but now putting June and July on there. Sorry?
So at least you know when it's going to be.
I do. Reasonable chance. And again, just normalizing that, there wasn't anything really out of the ordinary for this. And so again, I kind of asked the question, as these numbers keep getting bigger, we do more UHD, more people come to depend on this stuff. Is the way we're doing it at the moment the best way, or are there some smarter ways that we could deliver these big peak events with large amounts of traffic at the best quality we can to people at home? Because it's simply going to grow. Last slide is just a few stats, but fundamentally, the summary of that is that people in the UK like football, and they particularly like football when England do well. Thank you very much.
Which isn't very often.
Thank you. Any questions for Richard, please? Okay. Excellent. Thanks very much. That was very interesting.